Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, May 16th, 2024. Before we get to that, because it's a sort of a medium-sized story, but it has, in my opinion, huge implications. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the rescheduled Chat Fest. As you know, last month we started having an additional evening scheduled vid chat, and that vid chat was scheduled for tonight at 5 o'clock U.S. Central Time. I moved it to tomorrow night, Friday night, at the same time, 5 o'clock Central Time, because they were predicting more heavy and possibly severe thunderstorms in my area for tonight. And as you know, when I'm recording, I live in an area where the severe weather can literally spin up on a dime, and I just want to play it safe. I have to gather myself and gather my little dog and put her on a leash, and then both of us scramble into the backyard, into our storm shelter. And if I'm on the air, as has happened before, I oftentimes don't hear the tornado sirens when they go, and so on and so forth. So I'm just playing it safe is what I'm doing, folks. Now, I moved it, as I said, to tomorrow night, but then they revised the weather forecast again and said that there could be storms tomorrow night. So I have moved the evening 5 o'clock Chat Fest to Saturday night, this coming Saturday, at 5 p.m. U.S. Central Time. Now, the deadline for getting your comments and questions in then will be tonight at 10 p.m. So please get your comments and questions in tonight. I do apologize to all of you for having to move so many vid chat schedules. I want to thank you again for your patience and understanding as I try and get through this, what seems to be an endless cycle of weather that constantly inhibits any ability to establish a routine schedule, which frustrates me probably as much as it does you. But again, I want to thank you for your understanding. So let's get down to business. I've got two articles here, one fairly representative of the nonsensical boilerplate that we're getting out of the lamestream, propatainment, progressivist, libtard media these days. It's an article on the recent assassination attempt on the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico. It's pronounced Fico, folks. And then a second, shorter article concerning one possible motivation. And this popped up. I want to thank LGLR and KM and all of you who sent in various versions of the assassination story, because it more or less, I think, is a story not so much huge in and of itself, but with what it may portend. All right? I want to read the Guardian's synopsis of certain aspects of this scenario, two paragraphs in particular, because for me they epitomize the way the lamestream propatainment media spins everything in a crisis of opportunity sort of methodology to benefit the progressivist globalist agenda. But in doing so, I think it's pointing out a number of interesting motivations that may lay behind the assassination attempt on Mr. Fico. So this was dated just today, and I'm reading the second and third paragraphs from this Guardian article, and of course I will link it for you so that you can read it for yourself. Quote, "The background and motivation of this attack are not yet fully known. Ministers," and stop right there, folks. Whose ministers? Britain's ministers? The ministers of the European Union? Or the Slovakian ministers of Mr. Fico's cabinet? Who are we talking about? Ministers have suggested that the suspect now in custody, here it comes, folks, was a lone wolf who disagreed with the government's justice and media policies. But the case is widely seen as a shocking manifestation of the deep ruptures in Slovakian society. Quote, "What happened yesterday was an individual act, but the tense atmosphere of hatred was our collective work," unquote, warned the outgoing president, Zuzana Kaputova, an opponent of Mr. Fico, who is stepping down after herself receiving death threats. It will also fuel concerns about extremism and attacks on politicians elsewhere in the continent. So what kind of extremism? Well, that's implied by the next paragraph. Quote, "Mr. Fico has veered from the center-left to the nationalist right, and from being pro-European Union to taking an anti-Western, pro-Putin position. He once campaigned on an anti-corruption platform, but has faced corruption allegations himself, and his government recently scrapped a special prosecutor's office dealing with high-level corruption. Many have compared his recent politics to Hungary's illiberal leader, Viktor Orban, undermining the rule of law and civil society," unquote. Now, I suggest to you that all of that, particularly the business of taking an anti-Western, pro-EU, or pro-Putin position, is all code for the fact that Mr. Fico was increasingly opposed to the ridiculous migrant policy being imposed on the European Union by the European Union, and that he was recently announced as opposed to measures supporting the West and its proxy war against Russia in the Ukraine, and that the whole thing is basically Mr. Fico being against the globaloni agenda. He's illiberal, and this is against the rule of law. Well, the problem, as if you go on to read, is that the article points out that there is a rising center to the right populist revolt against all of these policies. They are not popular. So in other words, you can write the assassination attempt down to Mr. Fico not being a globalist. That's it in a nutshell. And he's hardly illiberal. What he really is he's a classical liberal. He's just not a progressive. Now, the interesting thing about that article is not only the boilerplate, that it gets it so wrong, but that it doesn't even ask the right questions. So I've also attached, or am attaching, a second article for you to read about this. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs. The article itself is very, very short, but it kind of showcases what I think is really going on with this assassination attempt, and in a way it implies the geopolitical fallout that may be a consequence of it. And that, my friends, is where the high-octane speculation of the day rubber really meets the road. Because I think this assassination attempt just changed the calculus of Mr. Putin's reactions to the West. That's what I think is going on. So the second article's headline here is "Leader of Slovakia Shot After Demanding Investigation into COVID Vaccines." And I'm reading 3 paragraphs from this very short article. Quote, "Slovakia, a nice country in the heart of Europe, is unique in one important respect. It is the only country out of the whole world whose leader denounced COVID vaccines and announced a COVID inquiry into excess deaths, corrupt influence of Pfizer, and ill effects of the COVID vaccines. Many of us were wondering what would be the outcome of this investigation. Will excess deaths be finally corrected and attributed? Will the cozy relationships between Pfizer and the media it sponsored be disclosed? What answers can we finally get when a government is led by an honest man wanting to get to the bottom of the pandemic response? Well, one thing you do is you accuse him of corruption. Now let's skip. The assassin, Juraj Cintula, is an operative of the progressive Slovakia. He is also the founder of the Rainbow Literary Club. Surprise, surprise. Juraj Cintula is a 71-year-old civilian. Was he capable of planning an assassination by himself? Was it possible for him to penetrate the state leader's security and get to the right place at the right time without help? In my opinion, that would be quite unlikely. He was probably not acting alone. Sorry, Guardian. The lone nut assassination spiel isn't really rational when you stop and think about it. And I'm foursquare in agreement with this article. I don't think that Mr. Cintula probably acted alone. I don't think it's possible. But now we have, in addition to all the other globalonism, we have yet another possible motivation, and that was that this man was spearheading a state investigation, the only one in the world, into all of the malfeasance around the COVID vaccines and the corruption that was promoting them to the general public by Big Pharma and the lamestream media. Now, I've mentioned many times before what Catherine Austin Fitts calls stacking functions. So with this one assassination, you've, in other words, targeted a target that not only was pro-Putin, was not towing the EU-NATO line on the war in the Ukraine, was against the migrant policy of the European Union, and more or less in favor of the types of policies that his neighbor, Viktor Orban, in Hungary has been promoting in that respect. In addition to all of that, he was spearheading an investigation, an official investigation by the government of Slovakia into the COVID vaccine and that whole narrative. So, in other words, if you want to find a motivation for this assassination attempt, there it is. And, oh, looky, we just happen to have a radical progressivist nutcase that we can foist the whole assassination onto. He's called a patsy. Now, I do think that all of this is probable. I do. I do think that there's something behind this assassination attempt, and it's not just a lone nut. And with all the billions of dollars, or euros in this case, at stake with a COVID investigation, not to mention the possibility of some pretty stiff criminal liability, criminal prosecutions in addition to civil. So with Pfizer and some of the COVID vaccine sponsors, you can start thinking in terms of Monsanto, in terms of their financial exposure to the potential of some very serious civil litigation. But in addition to that, you can think of criminal litigation. So would you take steps to prevent an investigation like that from going forward in Slovakia and possibly, and in my opinion probably, spreading from Slovakia to other governments? Well, yes, you would. So what are the geopolitical implications? In the past few years, I've been suggesting that two can play the covert operations game, and that if the West kept prodding and poking the Russian bear with non-government organization change of regime operations as it was doing and did in the Ukraine, that if it kept on trying to assassinate the Russian leadership. Don't forget that weird accident in Moscow that involved Vladimir Putin's personal chauffeur. And don't forget the bombing of Alexander Dugin's daughter. If the West keeps poking and prodding the Russians with these covert operations on Russian soil, that the Russians would eventually return the favor and play the same game. And as a result of that, I've been trying to warn the West that wet operations against its own leadership were a possibility. But now, in the wake of this assassination attempt, I think that this changes the calculus in a very subtle fashion. In that now, in this atmosphere, with so many leaders, particularly in Western Europe, that are being attacked by one or the other part of the political spectrum, and by attacked, I mean literally attacked, that what we're going to see happen is changing the calculus on the part of Russia. Because now it will be necessary for Russia to make sure that any message that they send by that means, by that method, is coming unmistakably from them and nobody else. So in other words, if there are any wet operations or covert operations of that sort against the Western leadership, from now on, I think the game has changed because of these types of events, this being the most obvious one. I think the game may have changed so that Russia will need to communicate its messages very clearly. Now, how might it do that? I don't know. It might be as simple as the expedient of warning certain people ahead of any such covert operation that they are now targets of a covert operation. It might be just that simple. But I do think that this assassination is not a message or a warning shot. It was quite literally intended to take Mr. Fico out. I do suspect Mr. Globalone and Big Pharma's hands all over this thing. But I also suspect that, as I've just pointed out, it is changing some of the geopolitical calculus with which Russia has to take into consideration. So lots going on in it. That will do it for today's News and Views, folks. Don't forget, I've moved tonight's Chat Fest that was originally scheduled for 5 o'clock to this Saturday. It's actually raining right now as I'm trying to finish this recording, so I'm trying to squeeze it in between rounds of storms. We had storms this morning that kept me up, and more storms probably headed tonight. So I do want to thank everybody again for your patience. Hopefully we won't have any severe weather and so on and so forth. But I'll see all of you that are members of the website on Saturday night at 5 o'clock U.S. Central Time. The rest of you will hear from and see you on the flip side. Bye-bye, and God bless.